I think of it as a kind of a thaw. Folks go from being frozen up, literally, and emotionally, to being able to say, "Man, this is what I'm experiencing," and have others say, "Yeah, we understand. We're right with you."
When a civilian enters any branch of the military, they go through a period of basic military training that's designed to change the way they think and act to turn them into a soldier, sailor, Marine, airman, or Coast Guardsman.
Hard work, hard work. Hard work, hard work. Hard work.
This is seen as an important time in the individual's life, critical for the proper transition from being someone not in the military to part of one of the greatest fighting forces on the planet.
Earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day. Get up out of 2:45.
After a period of time in the military, however, there's little done in any branch of the service to help that service member transition their mindset to life as a veteran.
Hard work, that's what they say. Hard work, I earn my pay.
As we often say here in the Change Your POV podcast network, after one leaves the military, they're never going to be a civilian again. And they're no longer a service member. They're this entirely different third thing, a veteran, with all the experiences, knowledge, strengths, and challenges that go along with that word.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work.
One of the most overlooked aspects of transition is a service member's mental health and wellness. If the veteran has their heart, mind, body, and spirit in the right place, and has a support network of family and friends to rely upon, then they're most likely going to have a successful transition. If those things are not in place, things can get challenging.
Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work, that's what they say.
I'm your host, Dwayne France, and I'm going to take you through a veteran mental health boot camp to give you some advanced training for your brain.
Fired up. Everybody on the plane. Gotta sit 'em on down.
These episodes will cover the many different aspects of veteran mental health that I, as both a combat veteran and a clinical mental health counselor, see, experience, and support veterans with daily.
Hard work, I earn my pay. Hard work,
I'm going to be joined by both veterans and mental health professionals talking about what you need to know about the stigma against seeking support, the different areas we need to understand, and provide some resources for when you think you might need them.
that's what they say. Hard work, earn my pay. Hard work, do it every day.
Get up in the morning and out of the rack, because this is some information that could very well save your life. Welcome to Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp. Hey folks, welcome back to the next episode of Headspace and Timing. I really appreciate you, as always, taking the time to listen. As you know, we're in the middle of this series looking at veteran mental health and the different aspects of veteran mental health that go beyond PTSD and TBI. And if you've been listening as the shows have been released, you know that we just got done talking about PTSD and then traumatic brain injury with Dr. Blair Cano. And as I'd mentioned in the first episode, as we're going to go through this, the next thing we're going to talk about is substance abuse. And when I considered who I wanted to have on as a guest for substance abuse and veteran mental health, for me personally, there was only one person that I knew that would be able to talk to this situation. And this is somebody that I've known for several years and I respect immensely. And that's Dr. Stephen Kidd. So I'll let Dr. Kidd kind of introduce himself and tell you a little bit about what he's doing before we get in the conversation. Dr. Kidd, welcome.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thanks for putting this together. This is great.
Yes, and thank you for joining us. I know we've been trying to get together to really spread the word about veteran mental health and substance abuse for a while. And glad we were able to finally get this started. So before we talk about that, I'd like to let you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and maybe what you're doing right now.
Sure. I've been with the VA for a long time, 27 years now, and and since 1999 have been at the Colorado Springs community-based outpatient clinic. And I was brought in to actually start a substance abuse program after they had not, Southern Colorado VA at the time had not had a substance abuse program for a number of years after closing the one in Fort Lyon. And so the challenge was creating an outpatient program that really met the needs of this part of Colorado. One of the challenges right away that I noticed is that there were no inpatient beds along the Front Range of Colorado, and we from what I'd experienced in VAs in the past, I knew that was going to be a great necessity because homelessness and substance abuse go hand in hand with veterans, and probably would be. They probably do in the rest of the population as well. However, a lot of homeless folks don't get treatment because they don't have insurance. So, but in the VA, that's not a barrier. So we see the 40% or so of our folks that come to us in pretty dire straits, also struggling with homelessness. So I knew that had to be part of the equation. So that's where we nurtured a relationship with veterans in town who agreed to start a nonprofit that became Crawford House, Colorado Veterans Resource Coalition, where I first met you, Dwayne, and are working together with these folks. So that's how I got here.
Yeah, and so of course, being very familiar with the process in your program, and I'm going to do my best. Now, I don't even know if I'm going to curb my enthusiasm, Dr. Kidd, and I've mentioned it to you, and I've told it to many times before, is that I personally believe that your program is the best substance abuse treatment program in the Central Mountain region. Having seen it work with veterans, both my work in the Veterans Trauma Court and in my previous role working with the Crawford House, just the program that you have put together and developed, I have literally seen save lives and change lives, and so I think it's amazing.
Well, we strive to be excellent and be and do what the vets need us to be and do, including not do what they're asking sometimes.
That's
Normally, it's providing a structure and providing a healing environment that I think is really, plus the kinds of content that we can teach that come out of the literature, that and linking up with Alcoholics Anonymous and the recovery the recovery community that's already there around us, that I think is all part of what we offer. My training was as an intern, psychology intern at the Cincinnati VA, and they had a very strong inpatient model. I experienced it as an extraordinarily safe and honest environment, where we went beyond. The staff went beyond just wanting to hear the patient's parrot back what they should say, but more what they honestly felt. And when folks can get really honest, growth can happen generally. It's not just one-on-one, though, but creating an honest, a sense of honesty and integrity in the group itself. Where veterans are communicating with veterans in a way maybe that they haven't, maybe that they've come short of anywhere except the battlefield, where things get very honest very quickly. So that seems to be a key ingredient to the healing environment that we've sought to replicate here in Colorado Springs.
And I definitely I've seen that again, as I've said, I've seen it work. Both a series of different types of interventions, individuals, groups, series of groups in the intensive partial hospitalized program. We'll get into that in a bit, but I'm interested to hear what really got you, and you said you interned at the VA, but what got you interested in veteran mental health and then substance abuse specifically, as opposed to, many of the other things you could have focused on?
That's interesting. Well, an interesting question. I have addiction in my family background, which was, I think, part of what probably more subconsciously drew me. So that's one factor, and then secondly, the staff at the VA. I wasn't just looking for a VA training, but the staff at the VA was extraordinarily cohesive. The psychologists there, from all the different things that they were doing, was an extraordinary group, and so I was drawn to that sense of teamsmanship among them, and then once getting there, the program, as I experienced it, just tasted it in Cincinnati, drew me further. But I'm sure my background was also a factor. And then getting on that unit and being part of the group therapy, psychodrama, all the different ways that they were intervening daily, was an extraordinary revelation. In fact, I remember thinking, I've said this many times, that I need a group like this for myself. I need to have my own recovery in a way. I'm just not used to people being so honest, and I could see the healing results right before me. So it was a personal draw as well as a professional draw, and I had a magnificent teacher in Dr. Sue Deerenforth, who went on to actually, beyond substance abuse, who went on to establish the National Center for Organizational Development for the VA in Cincinnati, which meant that she was working with work groups. She was working with groups to smooth out relationships, conflict resolution, those kinds of things that can be transformative to a group of people who have been at odds, etc. So she brought a lot of those skills to the substance use program initially in her career, and I got to be in on it. I feel very lucky for that.
And that's even that evolution, taking a look at that, going from just interest and then getting drawn in, that's something that I think, we veterans can find that even after the military, something to interest them and then gets drawn in. So it's great to hear that. One thing I think that's interesting is you've seen spans between, the pre-9/11 and the post-9/11 veterans. You started the program here in Colorado Springs, a couple years before, and so you were seeing veterans, maybe more non-combat veterans, Cold War veterans, and things like that. But when it's specifically with substance abuse, have you seen it change over the last 15, 18 years?
Oh yeah. So when we first got started, we still saw a fair amount of, and we still do see a fair amount of Vietnam veterans, as that's still such a large class. It's still the largest cohort that the VA serves. So it was older vets. We weren't used to seeing kids around the clinic, young families, and that's been the big change. After probably about 2002, 2003, we began seeing Iraq and Afghanistan vets just trickle in. Still very much the minority the folks we were working with, whereas now they're definitely the majority, and we're hearing a fair amount of tales about combat and significant losses and significant conflicts that occurred that were scarring, where substance abuse has been part of the answer to managing those emotions and those memories.
And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have these conversations at least very close together with PTSD and TBI, with substance abuse, because in the model that I talk about, they're separate and distinct, but they're not nearly separate and distinct. I mean, it's just sort of a way of talking about it, and they're very intertwined, in which
Right.
substance abuse and the use of substances becomes one of the ways that the veterans have tried to solve the problem. It's interesting, though, that you said that it was Vietnam veterans, and in the late 90s or the mid 90s, it's now 25 years removed from the veterans' combat experience, whereas in 2002, you're a couple of years, and in many ways months, from a veterans' combat experience. Veterans are reaching out sooner than decades after combat?
I think so, and I think VA, and which actually I believe it was congressional approval, but VA wanted to do a better job of reaching combat vets with this generation, and so they placed VA staff in military posts and bases to help with the transition. They did compensation and pension exams while they were still active duty. There's been a lot more coordination between VA and DoD with this generation than there was, and consequently, VA is sometimes criticized for not being prepared for the influx, but our history was that I don't know if you've heard the statistic, but that 20% of Vietnam veterans sought VA care. So 80% of them were in the private sector and getting their health care that way. Well, with this generation, 50% are seeking VA care, and I remember when the question was, how are we going to draw these folks to VA? That's no longer the question. No one's asking that question anymore. It's more how we're going to cope with the influx, because it's been so much more than we expected based on history.
Well, and that's even if that's the elephant in the room, as you well know personally, that I am a significant supporter of the VA. I'm not somebody who's going to bash the VA. I feel as though that, and I often say it, this is the skis that veterans are going to be going down the mountain on. I mean, this is the VA, once it starts to work for a veteran, it works well. And then there's aspects where the community can come in and support, which is really my role. But the VA of now is not the VA of 10 or 15 years ago, even, much less the VA from 5 years from now is not going to be VA of today. Therapeutically, we say, we're doing the best we can and we can do better, individually in therapy, but also that's really in the VA as well. And so your program, and you and your staff specifically, when I speak to veterans in the community here, is an example of dedicated professionals that are within the VA that are, simply doing not even the best that they can. Yes, the best that they can, but some very good work. So I agree. I totally agree. And having grown up with that, and my father was a Vietnam veteran, and I saw the evolution of services from the VA from when he was there in the 80s and 90s, and then even when I had joined the military, looking at it from afar. So the program is evolving. Now, with substance abuse Specifically, what do you think the challenge that veterans face regarding substance abuse that's maybe separate from PTSD? I mean, it's not, you mentioned homelessness before, but people will see a homeless veteran, maybe they're flying a sign or something, and they'll say, oh, he must have PTSD. It's more likely that he has other mental health concerns and substance abuse than PTSD.
Yes, and the first question I always ask when I see someone saying I'm a homeless veteran with a sign, I wonder if that's really the case, because if they're an eligible veteran, we have a lot of services they can take advantage of at the VA. So I've been known to ask, have you been to the VA? Have you checked out? And of course, so I'm always a little suspicious. Hate to say that, but because if they're eligible, we can get them off the streets pretty quickly. What your question was about homelessness and how those things intertwine with PTSD. Is that
or as much? I mean, substance abuse. What are some of the substance abuse concerns that you see in veterans? Maybe trends, maybe the overarching aspects of. When we talk substance abuse, I was speaking to a veteran recently, and he says, "So I don't have substance abuse. I just drink too much." So there's that, and so maybe just really dive into what is considered substance abuse when it comes to veteran mental health and things like that.
Well, we've gotten better at defining what's basically social drinking versus hazardous drinking. And most of the vets that come to us are way into hazardous drinking. They're coming to us with a problem, right? Or have an opiate addiction, which is just what a scourge. Or methamphetamine. Those seem to be the top three right now. We do get some folks, even though cannabis is legal, we get folks that are saying, I'm wasting my life on this stuff, just staying numb all the time, and I want help with cannabis. So I guess those are the top four that we're seeing. And all of it, even so, you think of opiates and you think of alcohol as downers and methamphetamine and cocaine as uppers. But all of it is in the service, whether downers or uppers, seems to be in the service of numbing problematic emotions that we associate with PTSD, unmanageable emotional states. And so that is the dominant model, I think, the way that we think about it. There's been a debate in the literature about which comes first, substance abuse or PTSD, and I think with some of the early childhood, adverse childhood events literature that has emerged in the last 10, 20 years, we're much more aware of early events that set people off that may not lead to a diagnosis of PTSD, but may lead to an addiction, where folks are trying to cope with patterns that were set early on, even before any kind of military service. And a lot of folks these days, because military service is voluntary, many folks are entering the military to get out of a family situation that is non-optimal. So we've learned to appreciate those factors as well as what happens in combat.
No, I appreciate that you brought that out, and that's something that's a theme that emerges as far as the military. The military is as much a running away from something as it is running towards something. And in my experience, it's not just the veteran itself, but maybe a young spouse, so a young hometown guy and his hometown girl, and she may be running from a less than optimal living experience. And so now you have two 18, 19-year-old kids trying to live life that bring in what they have from their childhood.
Right.
And then you said that that drinking and opiates and then methamphetamines is really the primary three. In my experience, or what I would see, is that the drinking and even the opiates, that starts while they're on active duty. There's a certain culture of I was 18 years old in Germany, and there was, the first time really away from home, and you hear about, going to Korea and all of these different things. So there's a culture of permissiveness when it comes to drinking in the DOD, and then opiates start with chronic pain and painkillers in the DOD. And then I've said this before, I think you and I have had this conversation, is, well, I was on active duty. We had veterans overdosing with black tar heroin in the barracks. And not to make it sound melodramatic and like it was as severe as it was in the early 80s and late 70s, but it was still significant. That those two things really might have a genesis in the DOD. Do you see that?
Sure, right. The drinking culture, kind of learned that. It's kind of a hallowed tradition, is to fight by day and drink by night. Or sometimes, like in Vietnam, it was the reverse: fight by night and drink by day. I think to numb oneself, or to help cope with the aftermath, the officers' club and those kinds of things, enlisted men's club. And the use of opiates in Vietnam was famous, actually, because that was very much part of the culture there. So, and then our use of the entire medical community's use of opiates has really been being filled down the river in that I blame the pharmaceutical companies in part for their inadequate, really, treatment of pain, but pain is not well understood, and maybe blame is not the right word. But the entire medical community has been sold a bill of goods about the use of opiates for chronic pain, and the dangers that now we're experiencing with more people dying from opiate overdose or drug overdoses than car accidents. So it's a terrible problem that we're really, I know the medical community is really working to reverse. I've been to medical meetings where doctors are being rewarded for counting how many folks have you taken off opiates, and that could be done not well as well. So part of my journey has been also to develop some knowledge about the treatment of chronic pain and how that needs to be a part of a recovery package for so many of my folks as well. Getting off opiates and then learning how to work with their own chronic pain, which turns out not to be something that you can just get the pills for. It has to be. It involves a lifestyle change, and it's much more complex than our primary care providers can often supply in a 15-minute session. So.
And that's that is the challenge, in that it's harder work. It's more sustaining work for the veteran to live in ultimately a pain-free life. It's more sustaining for them if they put in the hard work of changing their lifestyle and changing the way that they think and change their relationship with substances, where it's much easier to take a pill, or it's much easier to give a pill. And so that is the thing is how do we get veterans to understand that in the long run they will be better serve themselves and better serve their community by putting in the hard work than the easy work. That's a difficult challenge to overcome.
Right. It is. These are complex issues, right? Both body and mind are involved.
And that's in where you just said that the body and mind, and we talk about, you had said several times about numbing, but it is about numbing physical pain. When we talk about chronic pain, I have pictures of me overloaded like a turtle, of course, just the amount of equipment and gear and jumping up and down and jumping out of perfectly good airplanes and all these different things. There's more musculoskeletal challenges as well as neurological pain receptors in the brain. So there's a physical pain component that veterans are using substances to numb. And then, of course, there's a psychological pain component, maybe even a spiritual when we talk about moral injury, that the veteran may be, even going back to what you were talking about before, is the drinking culture in the military. It moved from being celebratory to a coping mechanism for physical and psychological pain, so to speak. How do we differentiate between the two? Like, which is the challenge that the veteran, or is it a differentiation? It's both sides of the same coin.
Let me add on to what you said. So there was an important sociological, if that's the best word, communal kind of experience to drinking in the military. That's when the group gathers. That's where the group begins to decompress together. So there's a whole group process that happens around that drinking culture that I think we need as human beings, but we're not very good at in this culture. We're an individualistic culture. And so not only was drinking or using part of a psychic numbing, but it was also part of coming together and not being alone, which makes it even more powerful. But so that the antidote or the lifestyle change needs to include that coming together, in my opinion, and the literature bears that out. Substance abuse treatment generally is best done in a group environment. My experience is that it's multiplicative. That the work we do in a group therapy session of 70, 80 minutes then repeats itself afterwards when the group has lunch together, or the group has enough. I want to follow up on that what you said about that. That's so much like my experience. So that networks are created and relationships are created that continue far beyond the actual group session, the treatment session, and it becomes an experience of community that is extremely powerful and extremely healing. We find out veterans have been talking to each other and about stuff that they may not share with the whole group, or even their therapist. And that's all part of the work, and it makes it very efficient and very powerful to do treatment that way. And when you're providing a psychologically safe environment, I think I veered a little bit off your question.
No, but that's exactly. I mean, and that puts me in mind of the fact that substance abuse drives isolation. When drinking goes from being a communal, celebratory, decompression kind of, a couple of beers with the guys and gals, and then develops into more significant deep drinking in isolation. I'm not using it as a communal experience, but I'm using it as an isolating experience. And then if we get to opiates and methamphetamines, there's a shame component where I start to draw away from my fellow soldiers, the people that I used to serve with. I'll be honest with you, we call them the Lost Boys. I've got 3 or 4 lost boys from my platoon that nobody has really heard from or seen. And these were guys that we served together in combat that they pull away. Of course, they're not on social media. Nobody's really sure exactly where they're at or what they've done. And we've lost some of our lost boys, gals, one specifically that I'm thinking of, to substance abuse. And so there's where it can go from this community, but then it's in isolation. And even going back to what you had said before, it's hard to be honest in isolation because you're not looking at yourself in the mirror. No one else is telling you what they see. And so it's sort of this trapped loop. Would that be accurate?
Oh, sure, yeah. Right, kind of caught up in your own circular thinking and feeling and without some outside input or putting yourself out there or disclosing, verbally processing, you just stay in these same patterns round and round and doesn't lead anywhere, or just keeps you stuck or leads downward in terms of quality of life, living life according to what you had planned or what you had wished for or dreamed of, even if you never articulated it.
And then coming out of that isolation, and what you said, coming back into a group or a network or the buzzword, and I think it's a very good one, tribe, as they talk about it today, but just I think back into my military experience as I would, teach a certain block of instruction for an hour and a half, and then, the squad leaders would take their soldiers off and work on it again, I recall before I went to Afghanistan, I had a couple guys in my platoon who had been in the region where we were going. We went out on a ruck march, and then we just had a talk about, in a brief, me and the platoon leader showed, some of the statistics and things like that. Then everybody broke down for chow, and then they were talking more about, to those 2 or 3 guys, they like kind of sat in groups. And so that's sort of a pattern of learning that veterans, that service members are familiar with. And then the substance abuse pulls them out of that pattern. Even leaving the military might pull them out of that pattern. But then the substance abuse pulls them out of that pattern, isolates them. And what I hear you saying is putting them back in that pattern can help not only draw them out of isolation, but help draw them out of substance abuse.
That's true. I should add that we also see some folks that come to us deeply ingrained in a subculture, a negative, I would say it was a negative subculture, a drug subculture, or a drinking bar subculture. These tend to be folks, not folks with PTSD, although we've seen some folks develop a negative subculture really around more antisocial behavior, thinking about motorcycle gangs and stuff that are kind of antisocial, I guess is the best word. But you're right. Generally, with folks with PTSD, they're more isolated. They've kind of withdrawn from human society, and that keeps them sick.
Now, you had mentioned before about not knowing. There's some discussion in the literature which comes first, the traumatic reaction or substance abuse. I'm of the opinion, when you have a bunch of chickens running around, it didn't matter which came first, the chicken or the egg. But the one thing I really appreciate about your program is that you don't just address substance abuse. It's not just the substance abuse. You also address the underlying trauma behind it, when there is, and I don't even necessarily say PTSD. There can be guilt, there can be shame, there can be lack of purpose and meaning, and some of these family issues, some of the things that we're talking about in this series. But you don't just address, hey, let's learn how to stop drinking. You and your program addresses the underneath component. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
I think maybe a better way to put it is that we try to create an environment where folks can address what they need to address. Mm-hmm. And for some, it's the relationship with my wife, and which is on the brink, and that's why I'm here. For others, it's the diagnosis that the doc just gave me, which means that I've got to stop drinking, or my liver is about gone. Or for a significant number, as you're well aware, it's the legal trouble that I'm in, and
the judge told me to stop.
Right. I've heard this. I've heard it said that it's either your lover, your lawyer, or your liver are the three factors that send you into treatment. And that seems like that's generally true. So we try to create an environment that is safe, emotionally safe, and where we're looking for folks to work on what they need to work on. And it's interesting, when the environment gets safe, what emerges for folks. Whether it's a sense of shame about their whole life, whether it's what happened to me as a kid, whether it's my current relationship, whether it's my cravings and the intensity of them and managing them. It's that my addicted self, and that I'm. It seems like when I'm in the mode, I'm a completely different person. I don't follow the rules, and I do what's wrong, what's not good for me. So that's the way we address them, is by encouraging, evoking, creating an environment where the veteran, him or herself, can say, "This is what I need to work on. I need to say this. This is what's going on with me." And one person in the group can tell it like it is for themselves, and it's amazing how that creates a domino effect where others say, "Yeah, I need to say this." And being in the presence of someone who's being brutally honest leads to, oftentimes, most of the time, honesty from other group members. Sometimes a patient that we get is really not ready to go there. They're really not ready to work on that level. They're the whole emotional vulnerability is they have a opposite reaction to it. And folks have to do their own process, and we try to gently help those folks be in another level of treatment if they're not ready for that level of honesty, because it is a process, and people go through these stages of change that are well established in the literature, and not everybody that comes to us is really at that ready state to change. So that's also part of the treatment process. It's kind of figuring out where people are at and getting them where they need to be.
Well, and I like how you said that is creating an environment in which the veteran can work on what they need to work on. I think many times the veteran is not sure what that is. They come in with this box or this duffel bag that they're dragging behind them. They don't know what's in it. They don't know why it's there. And it takes clinicians and the team that you've developed to be able to say, I understand, I can discern whether this is PTSD. Specifically, there is a criterion A event and it is something trauma, or whether this is more moral injury, or this is a failure to meet your needs, or this is X or Y. And so the team that you've developed understands the broad range of things with mental health, and it just so happens that substance abuse is the gateway to treatment. Would that be accurate?
Right. Yeah, sure. Right. We've done an initial survey of our veterans over a couple of years, and 51% had PTSD. Or had PTSD in their VA file. Not all of that's combat PTSD. Some of it's childhood or other kinds of trauma, or military-related sexual trauma. So that's a big component of what's going on, and we have PTSD programs. We have very good PTSD programs in the VA, both outpatient and inpatient, and we regularly refer folks to another program as a follow-up. But we consider what the work they do, being able to talk openly about what they're experiencing, to be the beginning point. And for a lot of folks it is. We talk about men and feelings in this culture and the kinds of things that militate against us doing this emotional processing that we so need to do, and look for folks to become committed to doing that process, even though it goes against all their military and family training, right? To talk about feelings instead of avoiding them and always trying to look good and look together and present the socially expected faith, if you will. So it's exciting work. It's wonderful to watch folks. I think of it as a kind of a thaw. Folks go from being frozen up, literally, and emotionally, to being able to say, "Man, this is what I'm experiencing," and have others say, "Yeah, we understand. We're right with you."
And I think, and that's something, even that dual interaction or that group interaction, this is something that has emerged in my discussion, in several discussions, when I was talking about a couple episodes ago with David Smith. He was a former Marine, and we were talking about internal stigma as a barrier to treatment. And he brought it out, and I've had it with a couple of other discussions of that there's almost a permissiveness that once a veteran receives permission from another veteran, saying, it's okay to talk about this, or it's okay to discuss your emotions, or it's okay to reveal this. Once they get that permission from another veteran, then the process accelerates. Do you see that?
Right. Very much so. Yeah, there's a modeling that happens. That's very exciting. About half of my staff are veterans, and about half of my staff are in recovery themselves. So you've got both of modeling from both sides, and it's such a privilege to be a part of creating an environment, a healing environment, where those kind of dynamics can happen interpersonally. Such a privilege.
That modeling was very important in the military as we grew up. When I went to airborne school, I knew that the people who were instructing me jumped out of airplanes, right? The black hats. As we go through basic training or boot camp or advanced school, we know that the people that are teaching us have gone through it already. And so that's the modeling aspect is something that veterans are familiar with. And then that might be another piece that's missing in their post-military lives. That it sounds like that you, in me knowing your program and seeing your program, but that's what you do is you provide an environment in which modeling can occur in a safe way.
Exactly. That's right. Whether it's staff to veteran or veteran to veteran, certainly it's true.
So, as we wrap up here, Dr. Kidd, any other thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience regarding substance abuse, veteran mental health, things like that?
Oh, what a privilege to talk about my work and our work. It's really our work as a team. One aspect of, I could say, of our working as a team and kind of being the person responsible for monitoring how the team is doing is that if we want to create this kind of environment for veterans, we also have to have that kind of environment as a team. And so we want collaborative and supportive relationships with veterans and to enable them to have a safe place to explore what they need and what they need to work on and express that. If we want veterans to do that, we have to be doing that as well among ourselves and our relationships with each other as employees and as workers together. And I learned that by watching my mentor create that kind of environment on the unit in Cincinnati. And she was following another great psychologist, Paul Diamond, who really established the program and established that kind of environment initially. In one way, it seems like a fragile environment that something can happen and suddenly people are wary or untrusting or something like that. On the other hand, it's a very powerful environment and it's a very stable environment. Stephen Covey, the son of Covey, wrote a book about the speed of trust, entitled "The Speed of Trust," and how having a trusting environment among people who are working together increases the efficiency so much more, and we've really found that to be the case. There's just a lot of stuff that goes on in the workplace that we don't really have to deal with, and I feel very lucky, and I feel very fortunate to work with the people that I do and be a part of this working environment and treatment environment, both. And it's been a great experience.
Well, and I hear in your words that we, in your team specifically as a group, but we as clinicians, as a corporate group or mental health professionals, especially those of us who are serving veterans, need to do our own work in development, awareness around what our blind spots are, and that's really the premise of this series of podcasts, is to not only help veterans understand more about these different aspects, but also help clinicians to understand, look, it's not just PTSD, it's not just traumatic brain injury, there's other aspects you need to pay attention to, and that getting that work done or developing that work can be very important. Now, it's amusing that you said your fragile environment, and it's lasted for over 15 years, and it's been, you've gone through some iterations, but it's again, and I'll reiterate it, I tell veterans, especially veterans in the community, that if you are eligible for VA services and you can get in the VA and substance abuse is a concern and you're in Colorado, then the best place for you is your clinic and your program. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your work and sharing that with the audience.
Well, thanks, Dwayne, and thanks for putting this together. I want to say one additional thing, and that is what you said about staff and supporting each other. When you're, as a staff, are dealing particularly with PTSD and some of the gruesome things that folks have experienced and have been very reluctant to put those experiences into words, and sometimes you're the therapist who's hearing it for the first time. Some self-care is really important, But let me just say that I think one of the most important parts of self-care is having other colleagues that you can. When I was part of a post-traumatic stress clinical team in Iron Mountain, Michigan, before I came here, I was so fortunate to have a colleague where it was both ways. And he was a Vietnam veteran. He had been a corpsman in Vietnam, had his own stuff, but he had his own trauma, but also had dedicated himself to helping veterans. And he'd hear a story, and he'd need to come next door and say, I just need to share this with you. And me the same way. There's a need to, I think, support each other as professionals that we sometimes neglect and think, well, we've got it all together. We don't need that. No, we do. We need it just as much as our treatment recipients do. So.
Isolation, and you even alluded to it earlier, in our individualistic culture. But isolation is not a good thing in any sense, in many ways, both with substance abuse and with healing and supporting others. And I think that's even important for veterans who may be listening to this too, is, we're all human. We get up and, feet on the floor and head to the ceiling just like everybody else. And so as we deal with these emotions, it's still there. One of your staff, very early on when I was working before, had identified me as a wounded healer. And we talked very closely, at length, about Jung's archetype as a wounded healer. And that we have to heal from our wounds, whether old wounds or fresh wounds, before we can expect to heal others of theirs.
Yes, and helping others heal can be part of our own healing process, too. Bill W. said that in Alcoholics Anonymous, that the most important thing an alcoholic can do is help other alcoholics, in changing that identity from being a problem to being part of the solution, being a profound shift. Now, some of us can get lost in our helping and get so into the helping role that we lose track of our own wounds and our own pain. Mm-hmm. But usually life has a way of bringing that up for us.
and if you're working with a team of colleagues that you trust, they would be able to do that before it gets to stage 4. Whereas if you're working in isolation or doing anything in isolation, it wouldn't be.
And mine have. Yes, mine. So that's certainly been my experience.
So I will make sure that that the link to your program and sort of the information about your program is in the show notes. And is there any way that anything that you'd like to maybe tell the audience, maybe how to contact you or find out more about what you're doing, Dr. Kidd?
I can. I can mention that we have a walk-in intake every Wednesday at 1:00 at the Colorado Springs Clinic up there on the 3rd floor, and that's the quickest and easiest way to get a hold of any eligible vet or eligible vet's family member to come get a hold of us. Sometimes the veteran's not ready to come in, but the family members sure are, and we can see family members as well once the eligibility is established. So that's the primary way that I usually talk to folks about making contact with us. I can give my phone number, my extension at the VA is 719-327-5660, and then I'm extension 44125. If folks have follow-up questions, I may be referring you to one of my staff members who specializes in that particular area, but happy to talk with folks.
Like I said, I'll make sure that all that contact information is posted for any listeners. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today, Dr. Kidd.
Well, Dwayne, thanks again for putting this together. It's a great service, and it's obviously bearing fruit.
Hard work, hard work. Hard work, hard work. Hard work, work.
So thanks for taking the time to listen to that episode with Dr. Stephen Kidd talking about veteran mental health and substance abuse.
That's what I say. Hard work, work, work. earn my pay. Hard work.
You can find the show notes on this show and many of the things we talked about at either changeyourpov.com or veteranmentalhealth.com, looking for episode HST030.
Hard work, work. Another day's work. Hard work, hard work. That's what.
This is the 6th episode of the Veteran Mental Health Boot Camp, a series brought to you by the Change Your POV Podcast Network and the Headspace and Timing Podcast.
Got to go make the call. Hard work, banging on the doors in the morning. Hard work.
If you're a veteran or service member, the family member of one, or support veterans in any way, then this series is designed to help you understand more about veteran mental health.
Hard work, manifest. Hard work, you gotta do it right. Hard work.
If you're just now getting into the series, go back and check out episode HST025, where we introduce the concept of looking beyond PTSD and TBI in regards to veteran mental health.
We're moving on out. Hard work, we gotta go and do the job. Hard work, load them up on the airplane. Hard work, in the early morning rain. Hard work, hard work.
Make sure you subscribe to the Change Your POV Podcast Network on your podcast player of choice and sign up for updates at changeyourpov.com and veteranmentalhealth.com.
Hard work, everybody on the plane. Hard work, gotta sit them on down. Hard work.
We would love to hear your feedback regarding this series and all of the shows in the Change Your POV Podcast Network. You can do so by visiting our Facebook group, leaving a comment, or review on iTunes.
Hard work, hard work. I earn my pay. Hard work, hard work. We're on the hard work, hard work.
Remember, veteran mental health and wellness is the basis of a successful post-military life, and one that all who answered our nation's call to serve deserves. Remember, brothers and sisters, you're not alone. Ever.
That's what I say.